We are recording this. It's going to be also streamed live on Facebook right now. So we'll have an additional copy. You want me back, Bart? Yes, I know that.
So the camera picks you up, John.
Oh, the camera.
That's scary. I spot.
Tell me when we're good to go.
We're good.
Now? Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Today is, in fact, July 21st, Ernest Hemingway's actual birthday. Barbara Ballinger will thank me for actually doing a birthday talk on Hemingway's actual birthday. So, well, that just happened to work out. Sometimes it doesn't, of course, fall on the weekend. But I'm John Barry. I'm the chairman of the Ernest Hemingway Foundation of Oak Park. And it's a pleasure this year to have Valerie Hemingway with us. Oh, that's great. And she's going to be in conversation with David Berner, who's right behind me. David W. Berner is an accomplished author in his own right. He teaches at Columbia College. He's a broadcast journalist, and he's also a member of the Foundation's board. So, David, thanks for agreeing to do what you do well, which is to talk.
Yeah.
And of course, Valerie Hemingway needs little introduction. She married Ernest Hemingway's youngest son. But she also worked in 1959 and 60, worked with Ernest in Cuba and took trips to both Paris and to Spain during those years, and then returned to Cuba after Ernest's death to help move some of the materials that housed at the Finca Vigía, the farm, the lookout farm outside of Havana. And Valerie is an author in her own right as well, and a lecturer. And not only that, she's really nice. She is. So welcome, Valerie. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
All right. All right. Now the technical part. I'm tagging it in for John.
Yeah.
Okay. I assume we're hearing me okay? So I think the first thing we need to do is to welcome Valerie. I have to tell you that Valerie and I spoke on the phone a couple of days ago, and what we thought might be a 10-minute conversation turned into 45. She's a delight, and it's really wonderful to have her here. And if you have any interest in Hemingway at all, it's a fascinating trove of stories that are not only in this book that you can buy later tonight, Running with the Bulls, her book, and there's no way that we can cover all what is in this book today. So we're gonna try to touch on as much as we can, much as you'd like to talk about. And what I'd love to do first is kind of start from the beginning. I mean, you were a 18, 19-year-old reporter working for a Belgian news agency, I believe, and you met Hemingway for the first time. You were sent there to ask him a bunch of questions that you already had written out in Madrid. So that first meeting, what was it like?
Well, it was pretty amazing, although at the time, can you hear me at the back?
No.
Okay, this is
I want
not...
to move that just a little closer.
You didn't pass the test.
Let's try that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
A little better?
Is someone saying no? Yes. Well, we'll give it a try. I had just turned 19 the week that I met Ernest Hemingway. I was sent to interview him at Hotel Suecia in Madrid, where I was living. I had grown up in Ireland, and I had, at 18, I'd gone to Spain for a year to pursue my journalistic interests. I had hoped to get a job in Dublin at the Irish Times, but at the time I went, they weren't hiring. But the managing editor, who was a friend of my family, said, well, if you get some experience and elsewhere, and especially if you go abroad and learn a few things and come back to us, you have a much better chance of getting a job then. And he said, by the way, I said, well, I think I'll go to Spain, because I had that opportunity. It was at the back of my mind. And at the time, he just suddenly said to me, well, if you send us if you see some interesting things, especially pertaining to Ireland, send them back, and if we can print them, we will print them. And that's exactly what I did. So I did have some pieces printed from Ireland that I sent home. They were social and personal items. But in the meantime, I met this couple through another friend who ran a Belgian news service, and they happened to be looking for someone to do English language interviews. And they provided the news item, they gave me the coordinates, they gave me the questions. And off I went, and I did a number of these, and they were very simple. I didn't even think about them. I got the questions, I got in touch with the people, I asked the questions. About it, until it came to Hemingway. Well, it was the first, the others had to do with business and other items. Nothing had been literary, but I had a very literary bent. And so meeting Hemingway, or meeting a writer, was really intriguing for me. And the fact was that I had a book. There was a pool, there were a number of English-speaking young people in Madrid. And we sort of had a place where we met. And when you went home, you left all your English language books there. So we had a little library collection. And I think there was one of Hemingway's books, I think it was Men Without Women. It was one of the early short story books. And at the back of that, there was a little, it was just about the size of a thumbnail, penguin book with Hemingway's photograph, which was a photo that was taken around 1944. And this was 1959. So the person I was looking for was, I thought, would resemble this photo, which was the only photo I'd ever seen of Hemingway. And I went to the Suecia Hotel, and I heard he had lunch there every day. It was the week of the Feria of San Isidro. And he had lunch there with 7 or 8 people every day. And so my plot was to go, because you couldn't get him on the phone. So I went to the restaurant, and I sat in a corner, and I looked out on all these people, and had my little penguin thing, looking for this person. And I saw someone that looked, I thought, like Hemingway. So I said to the waiter, by any chance, could that be the great American writer Ernest Hemingway? And he looked at me and he said, oh no, senorita. You know, over there, then was this old man with a white beard. And I said, that's Ernest Hemingway. So when he left, I plotted my meal, and as they were finishing their meal, I encountered him in the lobby and asked if I could have an interview, and he said to come the next morning. So far, so good. I was really, okay, things were going well. The next morning, when I see him, I've half an hour, which is generous, really, for an interview, and he was with his wife Mary and Juanito Quintana, and they left, and he said to them as they left, be back in 30 minutes. Okay. So I asked my first question, which is, Mr. Hemingway, why is it that you came back to Spain right now? You swore that you would never come back to Spain when Franco was in power, and he's still in power. What has changed to make you come back? And he looked at me and he said, Well, I was here in 1953 on my way to Africa, and then I stopped here on my way back in 54, and I was here in 1956, and now it's 1959. And sort of he's saying like, well, what's your question? And, I looked at all my questions, they were all to do with that one particular thing. And I had really no background material to fall back on. There was one thing, though. I had, in fact, when I was 15, read The Sun Also Rises, which in the English edition was called Fiesta. And I came by this book. Most of Hemingway's books all the interesting ones anyway, were banned in Ireland. Certainly The Sun Also Rises, and that's how I came by it. My best friend at school, we went to a boarding school in Dublin, and she lived in Cork, and I went to visit her, and she said to me, guess what? My Uncle Andy's on the censorship board. And he has a very interesting pile of books beside his bed. And so she said, the next time we used to go over to ride, they had horses, they were great riders, they were in Mallow, County Cork, good, they do Hallow Hunt, there's great horse riding down in that area. So we went over to ride the horses, and we made it with her cousins. We made an excuse, we needed to go into the house, and so we went to the bedroom and we looked at these books, and we each thought we would borrow one. But as you know, if you borrow a book, that's the very last time that book is ever seen. Well, by the owner, that is. So I borrowed this. This book had, it was this little edition of Fiesta. It was quite worn, actually, for a book that was being banned, and that shouldn't have been read by more than 1 or 3 people. I read it, it was fascinating. I mean, I understood some of it, and a lot of it I had no clue. But it did give me the idea that maybe Spain would be a great place to go to. And so it was 2 or 3 years later that I went off to Spain. So I was able to tell him this story, and I think the interesting thing for him was that his book was banned, and he loved that. And then we started talking about the Irish literary scene. And I told him that one of my great heroes was James Joyce, whose books were also banned. And I had bought Ulysses, and I still have the copy of this book. Again, I was probably 15 or 16, probably 16 at the time. I went over to England to see some relatives. And with 10 and sixpence, I got myself a copy of Ulysses, and I put a brown paper cover on it. And I put mathematics, and because to bring it back into Ireland, so you have a schoolgirl with a brown paper book with mathematics on it, you don't even open it up to see what's inside. So that's how I snuck my copy of Ulysses into Ireland. And so Hemingway was delighted and charmed, and so he forgave me, because it could have been, he could easily have said, well, look, since, out of here, my time
right. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But we were still chatting when Mary and Juanita came back in, and so he said, well, we're going up to Pamplona in July. You're going to be at the ferry, of course. And I said, well, no, I'm not going to. And he said, well, you have to. There's no point in travel. If you travel, you must go and see everything about the place where you are. I told him how I was doing pieces for the Irish Times. And he said, no, if you want to be a journalist, if you want to be a writer, you don't just stay in your own little world. You go out there and learn everything you can about everywhere you go. And then he said, take this down. He gave me lists of places I should go to, things that you should see in Spain, and people I should get in touch with, and he said, mention my name. I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing. I mean, I've never had such generosity from someone before.
Why do you think that is, though? Why do you think, because you're talking about, in 1959, a man who is world-renowned, superiorly famous, and he accepts your interview time, and then asks you to go with him.
Yeah.
Why did that happen?
Well, at the time, I didn't think it was going. I thought, millions, now millions of people.
Right.
I think that year 200,000 went up to Pamplona. The year 1923, the first time that Hemingway went there, at the urging of Gertrude Stein, he said there were 40 foreigners. There were 40 people who went there. And it was really as a result of the influence of The Sun Also Rises that put Pamplona on the international map. That now over 1 million people go there a day, go there each July, and most of the townspeople get out and they rent their houses at enormous prices. And this is all because of Hemingway's influence. But I didn't even know that I'd see him up there. But when I got there, and there was a little wiggle between that, because afterwards, you're 90, that was an interesting thing in my life. And I said, phew, boy, I really, I saved my soul on that one. But I forgot about going to Pamplona. There were other things going on. And I get this letter. In fact, I get 2 letters. But I moved. So I was going by the street, and one day the concierge, he waves me down, Senorita, Senorita, and he said, I've got some mail here for you. There was a letter from Juanito Quintana saying, we're expecting to see you up in Pamplona. We've made reservations for you at a pension, and if you cannot come, you must let us know you're not coming. And then the next one was like a week later, and it said, we're so delighted you're coming. And it was again Juanito, and a book which I still have, it's in French, but it was about bullfighting. And it said, you're to go through this book, read this book, because you need all that information when you come up to Pamplona. And when I got to Pamplona, I got to the pension. There's a note there from Ernest saying, we expect you at the Bar Choco for aperitif, and there were several young people. So it wasn't that I was one. He had a gather. There were his group, Bill and Annie Davis, of course Mary, and Hotchner, and George Xavier's joined us later, and Antonio Ordonez. But there were also a group of younger people who were the children of friends of his, some from World War II, the parents. And so that I was sort of one of, and I was paired off with a young fellow from the Christian Science Monitor. He and I were just, our bullfight tickets were together, and we were to be, we were to be a pair as to be paired off in this little group.
Right. When did he ask you to work for him?
Well, this was at the end of that week. We're just a minute away from that. What happened was that this young fellow, he was very gloomy, and he was complaining about everything, and I thought, oh, what a bore. But anyway, I thought I'd got to be nice to him. And we did go to the first bullfight together, and then he didn't turn up the next day. And Ernest was furious, and so I was deserted, and that sort of brought me into the adult inner circle, because the others, he had already little groupings of people, and so that fellow hadn't deserted us. A year later, when I was in New York, I came to New York for the first time. I thought, I'm going to look this fellow up, and I'm going to tell him what he missed. And this is a very tragic story, because I called up and they said, no, he's not here. And I said, well, where can I find him? And then I was passed on to someone else, and they told me that about 4 months before he had hanged himself. So he obviously was in a deep depression. But that, life is just full of these tremendous incidents that go on, but it was very sad that he clearly was in the beginning of a depression. So at the end of that week, that was exactly 1 week from from the anniversary of today, when Ernest was 60 years old. It was 60 years ago. And everybody, well, not everybody, but Mary and Ernest were talking about the birthday party that was coming up. We're all going down to the birthday party. And Ernest rather impulsively said to everyone at the table, about 6 or 7 people who had not been invited prior to, and come down to my birthday party. And I could see that Mary was It was a birthday party. There were going to be 30 people at the private house, the Davises' house, and she had handpicked all Ernest's old friends from many years, flying in from all sorts of places, from India. It was the Maharaja of Kush Behar and the Maharaja of Jaipur, and people from England, David Bruce, and who had formerly been the American ambassador to Britain. And I mean, there were all sorts of people. And then these scruffy people that Ernest had met at Pamplona were invited. Now, a few of them said yes, and some said no. They said they'd other plans. But then he turned to me and said, "Are you going to come?" And I said, "No." I said, "I have to work." I mean, I'm looking at all these people. Obviously, nobody works in the world. I said, "I have to go back to Madrid and do a job." And it was the next day that he turned to me and he said, well, actually, he turned to Bill, and he said, Bill and Annie Davis were the Hemingways' hosts down in Malaga. They had a beautiful villa just outside of the city of Malaga, and the Hemingways stayed there for the better part of 6 months. And Bill, they had a chauffeur initially, and the chauffeur didn't work out. Bill said, "I'm a great driver," which wasn't exactly the truth, but he did drive us all over Spain. So Hemingway said, he said, "Bill, don't you think our quadrilla," he called his little group the quadrilla, he said, "don't you think the quadrilla needs a secretary? What about having Miss Val as our secretary?" And Bill, of course, said yes, because he never said no to Ernest. And when Ernest, I thought it was a joke. You know, in Ireland, everybody jokes about things. We have a word called codology, which means nonsense. And in Ireland, we would have said, this is a bit of codology. But anyway, so Ernest turned to me and he said, well, what about it? He said, I could pay you $250 a month. And I thought, now of course I'm thinking Irish pounds into pesetas, into dollars, because I'd never had a dollar in my life. I'd never been to America or even imagined I'd come to America. And so anyway, you know, I said, well, I'll have to think about it, because I just tend to be a person who, I try to think before I leave, but anyway, and so I did, you know, after I thought about it, I said, well, if he really means this, why not do it? He said to me, if you work for me for the summer, it was supposed to be like a 2-month, until maybe September, when the bullfighting was over. He said, if you work for me, you'll learn a lot more about journalism than sitting in Madrid doing those, he didn't say stupid interviews, but he might well have said that. And so anyway, that's how it started. It was supposed to be for 2 months, and it went on until November of 1960.
Well, didn't you help research The Dangerous Summer?
The Dangerous, well, yeah, only in the sense, I mean, Ernest really was almost, he was like a one-man, you know, just monolith, because he did pretty much everything himself, but he'd say to me, remember that. He rarely wrote down notes. He didn't do a diary. He always had a little notepad, a small, you know, one of those, you know, 50-cent pads and a pencil in his shirt pocket. And he would write down one word, and that would key him in when he went to writing, to what it was. He never, he might also, if he heard a very interesting or curious, somebody said something that was funny or was clever or that, he might write down 2 or 3 words. But he would say to me at the bullfights, remember that, you know, because, but at the early stage, it never occurred to me that I would go on to Cuba and work for him the next year.
Right, so.
That was only later when we were up in Paris, and he was doing his final touches to a movable feast and checking out all the places and to see that he had the right topography and so on. And that was when he had the idea that I should come down to Cuba in January.
So you were in Paris and France first.
Yes.
And you helped him sort of remember again, like remember that sort of thing,
Yeah,
for a movable feast.
Right. he did that because then I typed up several chapters of A Movable Feast when we were back in Cuba. Well, not back, he was back. I was going to Cuba.
And you joked with us a little bit earlier today about how you didn't change any commas or anything. You had just typed it.
Well, that was it. I mean, Ernest was, I mean, his work was so important to him that it was so, you couldn't touch that. I mean, I think even maybe, well, Max Perkins in the old days, his first editor and scriveners was older than Ernest, and possibly Ernest thought he knew more when they first met, but I think later Ernest felt he had the upper hand. But he very much felt that when it came to literature, he did not need guidance in his later years.
And you learned, you mentioned a little bit about his work habit, about keeping notes and that sort of thing. But you also saw a lot of his discipline for his work, right?
This was one of the big eye-openers to me, because growing up in Dublin, where every other person was a writer, and especially our teenage years were often in the pubs, you know, I mean, that was where all the things were happening, or all the things that didn't happen were plotted to be happening. And so as far as I knew, writers went to the pub and they talked about writing, you know. And I'd never actually seen a writer at work. And it was a complete surprise to me that when Ernest wrote, I mean, there was an absolute distinction between his convivial afternoon life and his morning discipline of writing. In the morning, he got up, and I mean, I know you probably all know this and heard it so many times, but he literally did get up, and for 4 hours or more, but usually an average of about 4 hours, he wrote solidly, and nobody interrupted him. The only person down when he was down in Cuba was René Villarreal, who would come in with a cup of coffee. He might call René to get him a cup of coffee or orange juice, or well, he usually paired his own pencils with his penknife. But it was, I had no idea. I thought writers, the way I think a lot of people think writers, you know, they're just brawlers, they drink a lot, that. But Ernest, and it was, he had almost 2 different lives. In that morning time, it was nobody would dare make any noise or interrupt him. And then in the afternoon, people who knew Ernest from midday on, I mean, they saw this convivial person, and the idea that he even put pen to paper seemed, you know, almost impossible. Because he didn't, in the afternoons, in the evening he would read. In the afternoons, when we were in Cuba, for instance, and this was his home, like his writing life, the mail would come around noon, and then it would be after lunch that the mail would be brought in to him, and he'd look through it, and that was very relaxing, and he loved to write letters. And this was a good part of my job, was he liked to sit down. There'd be 2 chairs, and he'd be sitting down, and he'd have read the letters before he sat down, but he would tell me, he didn't have to, but he always gave me an introduction to who he was going to be answering the letter to. And I would just take it down in longhand.
His response to the letter?
His response to the letter. And I now can see that actually he signed that. He never once read through it. Because right now I'm working with Sandra Spanier on the final volume of the Hemingway letters, which won't be published until 2043, when I'll be 103. So see you all then. But it's so interesting to me. Actually, it's an uncanny thing to be looking at 60 years later something that you penned. You know, and I can remember a lot of the time he always did. Perhaps the thing about Ernest was there was never a vacuum of knowledge. You know, he always wanted to put you to let you know if he was writing, you know, to anyone. He didn't do many to Marcel at that time, but if he wrote to someone, he would tell you who they were, what the present situation was, or some little anecdote. So it was absolutely, for me, it was quite thrilling. I mean, I didn't see it that way at the time, But I'm sitting there and he's telling me all about the person, then he writes the letter to them, then he signs it. And so many people after he died came back to me. And they told me how annoyed they were that now he was dead and his letters were so valuable, but the ones in the last couple of years of his life that he had dictated to me didn't have the value because all it had was Ernest or Papa or whatever however he signed himself. And my having written them devalued them. So they felt angry at me, but I don't know, I couldn't really sympathize. I thought, because Ernest, in those days, Ernest didn't want his letters published. And he felt, he liked his privacy. He was very, and he really, his family and his friends, he protected. And the idea that someone, like right after he dies, or in the year or so after he dies, people telling me, oh, these letters are devalued. I thought, well, what kind of friend are you? They want to go out and sell your friend's letters for the highest. But anyway, that was just a little offshoot of that.
Right.
But we did spend about 4 afternoons a week, we spent 2 or 3 hours just him talking about his friends and we answering the letters.
Must have given you obviously an insight into the private life that no one else really knew.
It was, I was extraordinarily lucky, but with that came, the obligation. I mean, the one thing he said to me, and the only obligation with the job was that I should never write about it. Or, if you live with me and my family, you're privy to a lot of private stuff, and, since he knew he was a public figure, that I would never write. Of course, he didn't say, you sign this piece of paper, because in those days, you shook hands, and that was it. And it really wasn't, until after Mary and Gregory had died that I wrote, just because if I didn't write my book, everybody else was starting to invent. They were trying to invent blow up some little story of, maybe some big romance that Ernest and I had or something. And I was trying to, it was much more, just too generational it was friendship, it was work, but it really, the work was in a way incidental. I just came along at a time. Well, actually, it was one of these another odd things in life. But Ernest at the time was writing an introduction to a new edition of short stories, and he did this when they first came over in April, the end of April, beginning of May, in Gibraltar. And Mary did a lot of his typing. Along the way, his wives had typed, but I don't think Martha ever typed for him.
That's probably true.
But Mary did, and Mary didn't like the tone of this. Actually, this was published recently, I think in a recent edition, I think in Sean's short stories, the library edition that came out. But it is a bit sassy. I have to say that Hemingway was a bit feeling his oats at this time. And so what had happened was that Mary said, if he wouldn't change it, she wasn't going to type any more stuff. So like a month later, I turned up on the scene and thought, well, now I'll have someone who can type. But I didn't know. In fact, it was years later that I didn't know of that incident.
Right.
But it makes sense.
Absolutely. You clearly, though, you mentioned this in the book, you at least allude to this, that he felt for you. He felt something for you.
Well, he did, but it was a sort of, one has an understanding with people that, I think it was, when I met him, it was 10 or so years after he met Adriana.
Mm.
Adriana was 19 when I was 19. He said once, every 10 years I fall in love with someone. And I sort of went back, when he was 19, he fell in love with Agnes. When he was 29, that doesn't quite, because he was 26 when he met Pauline. It doesn't, it's a nice, you see, the thing about Ernest is, and I think writers, and maybe all of us, we sort of shape things to fit. You know, you make a nice little sort of scenario to fit what's going on in your life at the time. And I think it worked very nicely for him, because at the time, Mary was very unhappy with Spain, and she was I don't know, I wouldn't say she didn't care for the bullfights, but she didn't like the life. She liked, generally when she and Ernest used to travel, they traveled together, they did things together. They often had, they met a lot of friends, but basically they were a twosome. And in this case, Ernest had agreed to stay with the Davises before he told her. And she had never heard of Bill Davis. And one of the big mysteries, I mean, there aren't very many mysteries in Ernest's life, because almost every minute of his life has been documented. But the thing is, where did he meet Bill Davis? We think that she knew, that Martha Gellhorn knew, that they met in Mexico. A bit unclear. I mean, lots of people have said to me, do you know anything about Bill Davis's background? I don't. I mean, he might have been a CIA man or something. Who knows? One just doesn't know. Well, and there, in those days, you couldn't go to, I'll Google him.
Right, yeah. So let's get you to Cuba.
Yes.
Okay. So you've been in France, you've been in Madrid, in Spain, you've traveled, you helped research a couple of books. I can call it research. You go to Cuba with him.
Yes.
And you are there doing much of the same thing, but you also are there at a very tumultuous time in history.
Yeah, in the history, Fidel Castro came into power in January '59. So the Hemingways bought the house in Ketchum in either January, probably February of '59, I think. They decided they wanted to get a place. They were thinking of Ketchum because they liked to go there for the hunting season, and but things were looking very unsettled in Cuba. Ernest couldn't imagine leaving Cuba. He'd been there living since '39, but he had gone there from the early 30s. So he had habitual when they lived, from the time he and Paris from France, and they spent just a few hours that time in Havana. But Ernest was fascinated, and he came back and he fished there over the years and wrote several essays for Esquire, articles for Esquire. And then when he married Martha, or before he married Martha Gellhorn, when he split with Pauline, Havana was the obvious place to move to because he would be close to the children. Well, it had the sea, it had a lot of things, and he'd been writing there. He'd been going over for years in the 30s, taking a room in the Hotel Ambos Mundos where he could write. And so it was an obvious transition. And it was a little haven there. I mean, living I was there 7 months. But it was like a little bit of paradise. I mean, paradise seems, it's a bit overused these days, but they were isolated. And yet, and Ernest was not bothered by people. There was one telephone, it was in the kitchen. So, the staff answered the phone.
And the Finca at the time was,
it was
way out.
Way out.
Now
yes,
it's sort of in a suburb.
It's a suburb of Havana.
Right.
But it had, over the years, I mean, if you know the history of Cuba, it's turbulent. I mean, they had so many, the British, the Spanish, the Americans, in and out, and, it just hasn't had autonomy, really, in centuries. Ever since Columbus went, I don't know. They didn't have their own ruling, and a lot of it was badly ruled. It was the people didn't get the benefit of it. No matter who was in power, the people didn't get the benefit of it.
There's a wonderful picture of you sitting on the pilar there.
Oh,
yeah. You went fishing, didn't you?
Went fishing pretty much, unless it was impossible, every Wednesday and Saturday we went fishing. Or Hemingway had this, it was almost like, reminded me of boarding school, because every day he had his, every evening certain people came to dinner. And he didn't like more than maybe two extra, the most three, so that it could be an intimate conversation. And every day, twice a week we went fishing. Every morning before lunch, we each separately went to the pools to swim. I mean, there were requirements. On Sundays, this is probably shocking too, but Sunday afternoons we went to the cockfights. And Joe Alsop, who was, I don't know if any of you remember the name or know the name, but he was a popular columnist for the Tribune, the New York Tribune, New York.
The
other one, the Herald Tribune.
Oh, the Herald Tribune?
Yeah, and I think also, he wrote out of Washington, so he might have been in the Washington Post. But he came down, and Ernest didn't like the look of him very much. So, okay, we're going to take him. This will show him up. We'll take him to the cockfights. So actually, Mary didn't care for the cockfights. So the three of us went to the cockfights. And Joe had this incredible time, and he went back. And when he went back, then his next column was on going to the cockfights with Hemingway. And he later sent us the flack he got. I mean, the horror, people saying, like, what is this? Has our columnist gone crazy? Or
what did you think of it?
Well, the thing is that, when you were with Ernest, he had this enthusiasm about everything, and everything made such sense. I mean, I thought it was great. I thought it was terrific, and we put money on it. Ernest he always, whenever we did anything, like in France, we went to the races, and he'd hand out money, say, here's your money, and then the only thing was that that you had to know, you didn't just spend it. You had to know, in case of horses, the pedigree, the jockey, the conditions,
It was the same detail you talked about before.
And the same thing with the bullfights. If you went anywhere with him, you couldn't be a silent partner. You absolutely had to be part of it, You had to know what was going on and be interested. I mean, he didn't want any dead wood. So, but that was, and when Ernest died, Joe, that column, as the obituary in the Herald Tribune, the column was rerun. It was interesting, wow. And that was only like 2 years later.
We certainly want to talk about how you heard about his death, but while we're still in Cuba, would you mind reading this section where you had an encounter with Fidel Castro in Hemingway? Okay. This is about the fish. Some of you may know about the fishing competition that Fidel just happened to win. So it's interesting. So I just marked it if you don't know.
I'd almost forgotten this. I hope it's good. During the 2 days of the tournament, the course of the Gulf Stream was confined to a 15-mile run eastward instead of its usual 100 or so miles off Cuba's north coast. The many contestants kept their boats within a small area, all using the same space and causing everyone to fish in each other's wakes. We greeted some locals as they drew alongside and then floated past us. On at least one occasion, Castro's boat came alongside ours, and salutes were formally exchanged. We were not having luck with the fish, but Ernest and Mary kept his old U.S. Navy binoculars at hand to check the status of the competition. Mary trained the glasses on El Jefe's boat and at one time shouted to Ernest to come and look. Fidel had hooked one and was bringing him in. Ernest took the glasses and gave us a short commentary on the proceedings. Not a skilled fisherman, but a conscientious one, Fidel adhered to all the rules. We listened as Ernest described how El Jefe reeled in the fish and didn't attempt to gaff it before he grabbed the leader. Over the 2 days, the combined weight of the 3 fish caught by Castro gained him the first prize, a silver trophy cup to be presented by the author himself. We kept our distance during the presentation. It was the only time Hemingway and Castro would meet. Photographers took full advantage of the occasion. They exchanged a few words, and Ernest was pleased Fidel took that moment to let him know how he was both a reader and admirer of his work, especially of For Whom the Bell Tolls. The strategy used by the guerrillas in the book had given him some ideas which he put to use when he was in the Sierra Maestra, Fidel confided to Ernest. Mary, Toby, Betty, and I all shook hands with the winner, and I was pleasantly impressed by the geniality and gentleness of the 32-year-old leader. No sign of arrogance, only a reverent humility and genuine delight in the presence of one of his heroes. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, that's very good.
But it was, there was a time when Castro really was a great admirer of Hemingway's, and I was privileged to meet him when, after Ernest's death, Mary and I went back to Cuba to see what amount of things we could take back. At the time, U.S. citizens weren't allowed to go to Cuba, but Mary got special permission for herself. I was an Irish citizen, and so I had no trouble getting in. And Mary knew that I'd worked, with Ernest and the papers, and I knew what was important and what had been important to him that last year. And so well, first of all, the most important things were the manuscripts and, well, some of the letters, but Mary, well, the way life normally is, Mary said, well, we can leave Martha's letters here and Adriana's. Don't worry about those. But we'll take it. But her idea was that the finca, the house there, would become a learning center, and that we would leave enough samples of enough things so that if the in this case she was thinking of the Cuban people, she said to Fidel, I would like this to become a learning center for the Cuban people, and international people could come too, but that's what I want. And so leaving all the books, well, there was no way actually we could have taken them out, because there were no vessels of any kind going from Cuba to the US. And at one point somebody said to us, well, maybe you will have to go send the stuff to China and send it to the States. And we thought, oh, what a ridiculous thing to say. After about 3 weeks of sitting on the docks waiting to see if we saw anything with an American flag, we began to think maybe China isn't so far-fetched. We may have to send this stuff out. But what we did was, we were just so lucky. At one point we spotted this American flag, and Mary immediately rushed to where the boat came in and asked to speak to the captain. It was a really sort of old, bashed up fishing boat that was taking lobster tails and shrimp up to Tampa. And their refrigerating system had failed. And so their choice was to offload their cargo into the sea, or to put it in at Havana and leave it there. And so Mary said she would pay whatever, And at that time, she sort of motioned to me to move away, and she went on to the boat with the captain, and then she came out with a big grin on her face. Apparently, they were going to offload whichever way, if they just gave it to the Cubans, the contents. But so in that fishy boat, all those wonderful paintings that are now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., they all came from the finca. And then all the papers, the original manuscript of The Old Man and the Sea, and various other, the manuscripts in progress of Garden of Eden, Islands in the Stream, the book, the the African book, anything that was subsequently published, all of that material was down there, and we got it all out. But when Castro came, he was just very congenial, and basically, you see, by that time they declared themselves communists in Cuba. So Castro said he couldn't give permission because permission wasn't his. But he said, we may have to, he smiled and he said, we may have to break a little law. He said, I can't help you, but I won't prevent you, you know. So we made the arrangements and all
That's
stuff.
quite a story, to be able to get that started.
And the moment that, we were so excited, Mary was she was one of these people who sort of burst into song and dance at various times. So I think we were singing and dancing on the quay there at the harbor. And off the boat went, you know, and then as we went back to the Finca, we suddenly looked at each other and said, we don't know who these people are. You know, they literally had millions. I mean, probably even at that time, the cargo was worth several million. I mean, the paintings alone were worth $2 or $3 million. And they went off, and no insurance, we didn't know. And they didn't even seem to know, I mean, she didn't put Ernest Hemingway, Mary Hemingway, but that didn't, I mean, these fishermen weren't,
they probably didn't know what they had.
No.
Yeah.
And so until we managed to get to Tampa, a few days later, I mean, we were just on tenterhooks. Is it going to be there, you know? But that was a great story.
Tell us how you heard about Hemingway's death.
Well, after we went back to Spain in 1960, after Cuba, we went to Spain, and we're there till October, middle of October. And I stayed on in Spain for a while. I came to the States. Let's see. So it was next July. I got a job with Newsweek magazine. I was working in the news department at Newsweek, and one of the weekends I was out visiting my cousins on Long Island, and Mary knew these cousins, and she called me up and she said, you know, I had seen her in May. In fact, I'd seen Mary in May, and I'd sort of Mary had kept in touch with me quite a lot. And in fact, in May, she was very hopeful because she said, I think Papa's going to get out of the Mayo Clinic, you know, soon, very soon, because it was towards the end of May. And she said, Val, it would be wonderful if you could come and spend the summer with us. She said, I think that would cheer Papa very much. And I didn't say no, but I was doing exactly what I wanted to do. When I was 18, I wanted to be working in a newspaper, a news magazine, and now I was at Newsweek in New York. And so, but I said, well, let's, you know, I said, yeah, well, you know, I didn't say no, but I didn't exactly say yes. And then I get this call from her out of my cousins, and she said that Papa died, and would I come out to the funeral?
And you did.
And I did, and then that it had two consequences. The first one was that when I got there, Mary was very hostile, and and she said, well, you're working for Newsweek. And if indeed Newsweek had said, well, we'd like you to cover it. And I said, well, I can't, you know, this is a private thing. I'm taking the time off, but I cannot cover it. And it could have made if I had covered that, broke off with Mary, my life would have gone in a completely different direction. But that wasn't something that I would have been able to do and live with. And so Mary, she sort of cut me off, you know, I was there at the funeral, but any of the other excursions and things she did not include me in. And there was one other person who was also excluded, and that was Gregory Hemingway, because he had fallen out with his father and Mary some years before. And Mary, anyway, so by that strange set of circumstances, Greg and I spent the better part of a week together, and he was delightful and wonderful. I'd never.
You had a kinship because you were outside the.
We were, yeah, and he never was spoken of in the family because whenever his name came up, there was this silence, you know, in families. So I didn't know what this terrible thing was or why he was ostracized. But I said this was a delightful man. He hadn't yet, was he still in 61, he would have still been in medical school. Anyway, so that was the one consequence, was that I made a connection with Greg, because it was 5 years later we married. But the second consequence was that when Mary got over, a week later, she called me up all apologetic, and she said, it was just the strain of that. And she knew that I was their nearest and dearest friend. And would I come down to Cuba with them? So that, there my life could have gone in two different directions if I had just sort of said, hell with Hemingway's. But so I did go down, so I didn't get to work any longer with Newsweek anyway. So it just seemed predetermined that I was never going to be this great journalist I had imagined myself.
But did you feel at some point that there was a life, your life was, here's my life with the Hemingways and here's my life outside the Hemingways? Did it feel like that? Or was it?
Well, it felt like, I don't know, when I was with them, I think I put my life on hold. And the thing is that as I mentioned to you on the phone, when you're around Hemingway, you're in a different world. I mean, this was the man he was the most alive person I've ever known. I mean, no moment of the day seemed to escape. Everything had a purpose. In the morning he was outside. He would just go outside and he would determine how the day was going to be, the winds, the weather, and then whether you were going to go fishing or what you were going to do would depend on that. He had such an incredible knowledge and instinct about things, and he used it. Life around him was so exciting. I mean, I used to go, in Ireland, there were so many times you went hum and you had to do things, and we had to walk a lot, and you were on your own a lot. But with Ernest, every minute was, even, if he went out for a walk, he would come back and tell you all the different things he saw, what happened, what he thought about. And you'd say, that's amazing, because I went out for a walk and just minutes, and this is the way, and if it was just someone I'd met for an afternoon, or even had spent a week with them, but over more than a year and a half, this man just had such an inquiring mind, was such good company, and just for me, doesn't come in the books that I've read. His personality doesn't come across at all the way it's so different, because he also was introspective, but he was always thinking and always considering. He read a lot. He remembered what he read. He wasn't, in terms of conversation, he was much more likely to make you talk to him, because he wanted to hear all about you, and he made your life be interesting. And one of the prime things was when we were driving down that first time to the birthday party, driving down from Madrid to Malaga, about a 4-hour drive, maybe. Part of it very rough mountain country. And Ernest he's telling me now, these people are coming to General Batlana, was going to come to his birthday party, and then there was a Maharaja, but he was telling me about these people, and I had in my mind, it was sort of like a great big, either a theater or a cinema scope. I was thinking these people, and then these people came to the party, and I'm looking around saying, where are all these characters? And finally I sort of pulled Bill aside and said, where's the general? There he is. Well, Buck, I don't know if any of you met Buck Lanham, but Buck is sort of small, and with Ernest, he was positively mousy, but Ernest he created such characters, and he made people be so exciting that I just think he had this thing of seeing through the ordinariness and bringing out areas of people that you just didn't see it until he said, because Buck was a real hero of his. And when I really tried the first few times I met Buck to sort of say, like, how can I correlate this? And there was, you know, there were just several other people, like Gianfranco was fun. I mean, these people, when you got to know them, but Ernest had this way of, I think, understanding human nature, and I think embellishing on it. And maybe, I think today we were talking about something, I think it was Bob who said about the truth, you know, Ernest embellishing the truth, the family said that. But indeed he did. But I'll tell you, if we didn't embellish the truth, how dull our lives would be.
Well, that's an extraordinary thing to notice in a person, that they are able to make your life and the time with that person feel extraordinary. And that sounds like that's what Ernest Hemingway was like for you.
Yeah.
We want to ask the audience to have questions, and feel free to ask those questions. I want to work the microphone a little bit, so I'm going to walk around like we're all, I think most of us are old enough to remember Phil Donahue. So I'll run around a little bit, try to keep the microphone on those people so that we can continue to record. Is that okay with you, Valerie? Okay. All right. I want to get this lady back here because she jumped at it immediately. And I'll be over. Okay.
So I understand what you're saying about his personality being larger than life, but also he definitely had his demons, the alcoholism and the misogyny, you know. And I think that, like, some of the books I've read talked about some of his dear close friends, he would push them away and fight with them, and you know. And I could see how he would be someone who you walk in the room and he's the center of attention.
Did you get
Well,
that?
yeah, I got that, and I'm processing it, because you see, I mean, this is sort of where, I mean, I think possibly each one of these things could be true on a certain level. I mean, I don't see misogyny, but possibly, are we talking about his books? I'm just trying to think.
Well, when you think about his marriages, and he was married 4 times, and you know, I think the first wife, Hadley, they did truly love each other, and then Pauline came into the scene, and then Martha Gellhorn. It seems like they got along just for a short period of time because she was his equal, and he didn't like that.
Well, I mean, I think maybe he didn't like that in marriage. I mean, I think he really was quite happy with that.
Right.
I mean,
wanted
it's
a woman who idolized him and took care of him.
So what's new?
Well, the thing, I mean, I knew Martha very well, and I know she always said to me, I should have listened to my mother.
Yeah.
My mother said, live with him, but do not marry him. and I mean, I think the mother knew Martha. I mean, Martha had many lovers before. I mean, these things work in many different directions. But I mean, you know, I mean, I think that's a sort of debate, but it's more an academic point than a point of thing. The other thing, I mean, he did, yes, you know, if you take a whole lifetime, people do quarrel. Ernest very definitely had a short temper. He really, and he knew that, and he did say, I don't know if I mean, he certainly said, the way we always do after you go to confession, I will never do that again. But he said, I plan to work on this, and I'm not going to. But he would fly off he did, and I mean, he did have certain traits that were, if he distrusted people, they were not in the inner circle. If you weren't a loyal friend, I mean, he felt he had to trust people who were around him, and if you didn't trust them, they were out. But I don't think more than anyone. I mean, he had very good friends to the end, really. You know, I mean, over life, I think, even when, especially when you're on one continent and another continent, you know, people's lives just diverge. But he definitely had fallings out. I mean, there were a number of character, faults that he had. I mean, no doubt about that. But for being around a person, he really, I mean, everything, I stand by everything I say. I mean, I was very lucky not to fall out with him, but because I think it was a short period of time. But for instance, I mean, he was friends with Hotchner from 49 till he died. I mean, Juanito Quintana from 23 till he died. I mean, a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And people, apart from what he wrote about Fitzgerald in A Movable Feast, I have a lot of friends who love Fitzgerald and who are horrified by that. And yet, the many times that he told me the story and told me other stories about himself and Fitzgerald, it was always with such affection. I mean, I think, you know, as time goes on, we look at things, our view of things today is so different. Just for instance, 6 years ago, I taught a Hemingway seminar in the MSU Billings. I live in Montana State University, Billings. And I taught the same course last year. And the difference, first of all, the first time I had maybe 13 students, and I think 8 of them were men, and the other, five were women. And the men were sort of all gung-ho about Hemingway and that, and the women were, you know, okay. This time, I was so surprised. The women were up in arms. I'm wondering, why are these women in this class? It was the other way around. I think I had 2 guys and 12 women, something like that. Mm-hmm. And the women were, I mean, they really disliked Hemingway. They just disliked him because it was right when I was teaching. This was all this not you too. Is it you too? Me too. Me too. The Me Too movement was on. And I came in and I'm thinking, why are these people sitting here? But you know, the thing is that it wasn't until, and I sort of changed the curriculum a little bit, because at the time they wanted, the powers that be wanted me to do the biography. They say, Hemingway, everyone loves Hemingway's character and they want to emulate him and so on. And so we're going to do biography with the stuff. And I thought, I'm not going to get into the biography. But what I did was I took some of the letters from Carlos Baker's selected letters. Like that letter he wrote when he's in the hospital in 1919, he wrote to his parents, and he had some little illustrations at the bottom of it. And it was just such a loving letter it was to his parents, but also included all the family. Like, it was like a dear family letter. It was about 2 or 3 printed pages. And he was the age that these young people were, more or less, at that time. And that suddenly, then they saw a completely different Hemingway. They now saw a person that was like a real person that they could, you know, the sassy things he said, just the way he was, that was sort of the way they are now. Right. And so I think so much is how you know, how you're able to present something and how you can put it in context. Sorry.
So another question here.
You give a wonderful portrait of Hemingway's behavior, and I'm wondering if you were aware of the surveillance of Hemingway by the FBI, and if you saw a change in his behavior when that started to happen, and whether you think that contributed to his death.
Well, I think the death was a culmination of ill health and depression and the loss of the impending loss of really all his life's you know, his books and so on, his place, his little paradise in Cuba, and not having he didn't have a comparable place anywhere else that he could go to, and but the FBI indeed were surveilling him, and he knew that, and everyone said he was paranoid. And I could quite understand that it was the case, because in a strange way, when I was growing up in Ireland, family had a little hotel I spent my holidays in. And one of in fact, the head of the IRA was incarcerated in the Curragh internment camp. He had escaped, and he came out to our hotel. He used to meet his wife, who was American, at the hotel. And She was a journalist. She was a journalist. I mean, she may have been the person who gave me the desire to become a journalist. Terry Cronin, who was Sean Cronin, later worked in Washington, D.C. He was the U.S. correspondent for the Irish Times for many years till he died. But Terry, she started the first glossy magazine in Ireland, Creation magazine. Terry was an absolute, you know, she was a fan. I mean, I was a fan of hers. She was my, well, not really an idol, but she was someone I liked, I would want to emulate. And Terry and I would meet in town, and I'd sometimes do some things for Creation, but she also sent me with messages. United Irishman was a newspaper which was the Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin was the political side of the IRA. And I didn't even know, because this is the way, unwittingly I was carrying messages from the escaped head of the IRA to the Sinn Féin, to the United Irishman offices. But when Terry and I were in town, and she'd say, "Val, don't look around now. There'll be specials behind us," which was sort of the equivalent of the FBI. I mean, I was familiar with that type of thing. So when Hemingway said that, I mean, in Ireland, you know, you had to watch your back all the time. So I thought that was perfectly normal. But it was other people who thought, I mean, even to well after his death, I think it was Mike Reynolds who got those files, and it was confirmed. But everybody around Hemingway said he's nuts. You know, but he was actually very astute.
So you're saying he was nuts because he was paranoid because of it. So it did.
No, I know he knew that it was true, but
Right.
everyone around him was telling him, "You're paranoid. It's not true," which is probably even worse. I mean, it was probably worse having people telling you you don't know what you're talking about. When Hemingway was a very astute person. I mean,
He knew.
This is a person, at his worst, he was smarter than probably any of us in this room.
Another question here?
Yes.
I would like to say thank you for just giving us this time and sharing your opportunities that you had, which are very, very good to be able to participate and be able to, you know, just realize that this was a great opportunity to make your life better. How would you share with younger people to make them better than they are, whether it's journalism or anything else, that you might have learned during this period?
Well, one of the things that I always tell young people is, you know, go for it. You know, if something comes up, give it a try. Because, you know, when I first going up to Pamplona, should I go up to Pamplona? Okay, do it. It's, you know, it's fun, go up. And then should I go to the birthday party and take the for 2 months, you know? And so it went, because one thing very often leads to another. And so often you meet, I mean, I find everything in some way is connected. I can talk to people in almost any country I go to. We know someone who knew someone, you know. But so I think the thing is to being open to things, not saying that, I mean, I feel you should be, it's great if you can be focused on things too. But so many young people, they just don't know. You ask them, you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to study? I don't know. I'm going to try. You know, and that's good. But you have to do it with a positive feeling. You know, not just say, well, I don't know. But it's good to accept opportunities. I mean, I just, like when Mary said, come to Cuba. And even though I really wanted to be working for Newsweek, I thought, I have to do this. I mean, it's all predestined. So I think it is taking opportunities. And if it doesn't work out, there's always something else.
Another question here.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for sharing Prudence Hartwell's Important Day Michigan. I was wondering if Hemingway ever shared about his time in northern Michigan, when he was in places like Cuba or Spain, and what he shared with you about his time in the north here in America.
Well, you know, this is probably going to be disappointing for you because it's not that he may have said it, but if you have to think of me coming from Ireland, in Spain. I never imagined I'd come over to America. And even if he did talk about that, before I came this way, it would have been, you know, he might have talked about Oak Park, Northern Michigan, but those would have meant nothing to me. It took me some time, you know, to figure out, and especially it was after he died, and Mary asked me if I would work on the papers, gather all the papers together and sort them out. And that was when I learned, you know, then a lot of the things that he said, or that, you know, that I just remembered him talking about, because I know he had a great fondness for Michigan. I think Michigan was the, you know, Oak Park was sort of the corset. It was, you know, everything you were in, you had to be in line here. And I mean, I'm sure, you know, he had fond feelings for it, but Michigan was sort of like the summer and recreation time, and time he went off hunting with his dad and fishing and so on. So he had a completely different thing. But if he spoke about it, I mean, I have to be truthful with you, it just went above my head because I had no idea where or what Michigan was, and I had no...
We get one more question here, so we have time for the books and people in a line and sign.
Did he ever talk about his relationship with Dorothy Parker, and was it as filled with animus as has been alleged?
So he did, he spoke about, in fact, the New Yorker, when I first came to America, I stayed at the Algonquin Hotel for a few months and got to know a lot of people on the New Yorker. And that was because he talked a lot about, you know, Dorothy Parker, John O'Hara, I mean, various people who were at the New Yorker at the time. I was surprised later when going through the papers, seeing, you know, that poem, that very naughty poem he wrote about. You see, that is one of the things about Ernest. I mean, he definitely wasn't perfect. I mean, we don't want people to be perfect. If you're perfect, you're a saint, and you know that you don't belong down here. But he did. You see, he could be very cool and satirical about people, but he could still have great affection for them. And I think part of that was part of that time, because growing up in Ireland and England, we had, the humor was really black. I mean, people said things about people that were outrageous. I mean, you just wouldn't get away with anything today. And I think Hemingway belonged to, you know, that generation where people said, but he had great affection for Dorothy Parker. In spite, and you see, the paperwork doesn't show that. But if he found something was satirical and he just had this wicked wit, you know, that would override his good sense and friendship for the moment.
Valerie, if there's, this will be the last thing, if there's one thing that you want people to remember or know that you learned about Ernest Hemingway, that this is going to be hard because it hasn't been written or talked about or over-analyzed in a million ways. Some little something, good, bad, ugly, just something that you remember that was really striking.
Well, I mean, the thing, I mean, that I felt, the thing about him was that he was so human. You know, he wasn't like the thing you think of. I didn't know him as a celebrity because he wasn't a celebrity in Ireland when I met him. I think that was a different take for him. He was sort of quizzical. That you really haven't, you know, you really aren't coming because you think I'm this great personality. But the humanity that was there, that because he was, and because it was good and it was bad, and it was the short temper, and it was the saying nasty things about people and that, but he himself had a sense of that. He definitely had a sense of, you know, that he wasn't perfect, which also doesn't really come about. But what I liked most about him was that thing with people, with animals, with, you know, he had this sort of softness that doesn't come out at all anywhere else. And to be with him was, I mean, it really was a great privilege.
Thank you very much, Valerie.
Go right ahead. this has been going on for 35 years. Excuse me, Valerie, but in those 35 years, we've often said happy birthday to Barbara Ballinger, beloved librarian for Oak Park, and she's here today, so I think we should, this is her birthday too.
Oh, wow. Happy birthday. I think we have the books back here. We'd love for you to purchase them, and I'm sure Valerie would be very willing to sign them on Coffee. And we'll have a seat back there, and we'll do that. So we want to thank Valerie again, thank all of you for being here. Appreciate that very much.